Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video. Today we are finishing the Big Eyes district from Hermitcraft Season 8, which just finished fairly recently. And there are a lot of empty plots in the district at the end of the season because it was quite short and finished very abruptly. I don't know if you've seen it, but if you haven't, go check it out, it's really good. But there are a lot of empty plots, and I thought it would be a really cool idea to just finish them off, finish the district off, and sort of experiment with the different styles used, because this is like a style that I don't usually build in. I've never built anything like this before, and I think the style used here is just really cool. The first thing you'll notice about it is the color palette. It's made out of very warm colors. There's a lot of bricks and pinky colors, quite a few oranges, yellows, and reds. And they're quite bright, but slightly muted because most of the colors are made out of terracotta, which are more dull, but they're still colorful. So it gives you the pop of color without being overwhelmed by the color. And then there's also cooler colors like greens and blues, just to give a pop of variety, I guess. It complements the rest of the colors very nicely. And they're usually used in the roofs with the copper or the dark prismarine. And it just adds some contrast, which is really nice. Another interesting thing about this style is that wood isn't used as a, wood is basically only used as a detail block, which is really interesting because the amount of different blocks, intricate cell blocks like fences and signs and trapdoors you can make with wood, you can't do with any other blocks. It's really interesting to just have it be used for detailing. And this one I would usually use it as a roof or the walls or something major. Because I build it a lot in survival, and so it's an easy block to get. The blocks used here are particularly hard to get. Lots of terracottas and just really, and a smooth sandstone. That's very grindy to get in survival, so kudos to B-Dubs, Tango, and Corrales for doing half the district, most of the district in survival mode. That would have been a lot of time. But yeah, it was really interesting to sort of switch up how I use wood and the different blocks. And then you'll also notice that the pathway is, it frames the city. The blocks are more like triangles or ovals in this, the blocks of buildings. And it sort of makes it feel cozy because it's not a rigid grid. And it just creates the atmosphere and just adds to it. Because it's sort of a winding route, and it just feels very natural and organic. I think the setting of this town is also very important. It's right near a little alcove bay sort of thing. There's a mountain behind it, and there's lots of greenery in it, and it just sort of ties it into the environment. and makes it look like, I think it was supposed to be some sort of like Italian village, like vaguely inspired by Luca, the Disney movie, and I really love it. It's beautiful. In order to sort of recreate the style and make sure the buildings that I made meshed with the ones that were already there, I reused a lot of the very similar color palettes for different builds. So all the red builds have very similar color palettes and stuff, and it's very cool to have like to texture the build with blocks that shouldn't go because they're significantly different for it to like look a little out of place, but in this sort of style it really works and I love it. Like with the red buildings, you can see that they have crimson planks, stripped crimson planks, and it shouldn't go because it's a red building and the crimson planks are almost purple, but it does, and it adds a pop of color and detail to a section where you maybe can't add in like windows or something. The window shapes were also really interesting because a lot of the buildings ended up having 2 high, 1 wide windows, which makes the buildings look taller and skinnier, but it doesn't remove the atmosphere. Like, it sort of makes it feel like the buildings are sort of towering over you, but in a cozy sort of way and not like a claustrophobic way. And it's really interesting how that just the shape of the windows makes a building feel different, as well as the shape of the roof. If you get the shape of the roof wrong, it looks really weird. And I didn't add interiors to most of them, but some of the ones with bigger windows on the ground floor, I added in some interiors, like this bakery, for example, because I think that when you're walking around, it's nice to look in a window and see like a cake or something nice. I also think like the bottom of the buildings and how they connect makes a lot of difference to how it feels from the ground. So when you're walking around, the height of the entrances and whether the building has an implied like foundation with like stone for a couple layers on the bottom, I think it really makes it look the atmosphere a lot different. So if you have like a couple steps up to the door and like a little mini balcony there, that creates a very different atmosphere to have if you have it under the ground or like down a few steps like you see in London. I've added a couple like with down the steps entrances, but I think the ones that step up or are just almost level make it look a little, I don't know, they just sort of make the atmosphere a little more Italian rather than London, like, because in London they have like a lot of like half below the sidewalk like entrances and like levels, and I think that the way that stepping up the entrances makes the street feel and look was a good idea. And I think also adding balconies on the upper level made the buildings look like they were sort of hanging over you, which made it the buildings look a little taller, but also, I don't know, it sort of brought the buildings closer together, or it felt like it. And it created a cozy, like, neighborly feel, I think, because if you have lots of balconies, then you can sort of like imagine people like standing there and talking to each other over the street, and I think that just makes it a very cozy atmosphere. I also experimented with a lot of the roof shapes, so the ones that were there were like very slightly slanted, and sometimes the edges were lower than the roof on top of the building itself. But I added some weird roof shapes, I think, with more like curves and different shapes to frame the top of the building, I guess. And I think it turned out pretty cool. I don't know, let me know what you think about the roof shapes in the comments below. What I also noticed was that in some of the buildings, B-dubs and Tango and Keralis used like brick walls to create texture within the buildings, which is really interesting because it creates depth, but it also it makes it feel like the building was built a long time ago and it's starting to degrade, but it's still like, it's not like overrun or with plants or anything, like it's not overgrown and it's not like a ruins, but it's just, it's aged a bit and it's really cool. So I did that in a couple of buildings. And I think it's really important to add sort of like a liveliness to builds. So whether that's adding antennas on the top of the roof or adding like a smokestack or something, just to show that like it's moving and it's alive. I think it adds a lot to the atmosphere and the feel of the build, and when you walk around, it's just those little details that make it feel nicer. I thought it was interesting that I think I used every single wood in this. I know I said this before about how wood was used as like a different sort of block than I would usually use it as, but I think it's really interesting because there was a lot of like acacia wood used in conjunction with like terracotta, either just a normal terracotta or orange terracotta. And I think that it added a lot of color to just plain terracotta. It's very interesting how it was used and how I got to use it with the wood and with terracotta, because it made the color different, because when you contrast it with something like that, it affects the way that you see it, and it just added more color to it without it being vibrant orange, which I thought was really cool. And despite the big guy's hatred for birch, I did use birch in conjunction with sandstone, because it added texture. Like, what can I say? It added texture and color, and it looks good. Birch is a good wood. But yeah, I would have never used crimson wood with orange before. I don't use crimson wood like barely at all, but the shape of the trapdoors and the color of it, it just makes sense. It was really cool to use all of the different, especially the newer blocks like copper and the nether woods. It was a very experimentative project for me, and I enjoyed it greatly. One of my favorite combinations from this was using bricks as a foundation, or a separate, or like even like a texturing block with red concrete and concrete powder. That's probably one of my favorite combinations because it makes the bricks pop, but it doesn't look wrong. Because the bricks look more vibrant than they would if they were by themselves or with a grey, but it makes it look really good. I think what's also interesting is a lot of these buildings were just sort of like rectangular prisms or cubes or something, or like a very simple six-sided shape, which is interesting because when I build, I like to add in lots of different shapes to have variety and make it not just a square. But I think what has been done here is that there have been lots of external details added, like balconies in weird places. I don't usually add balconies like on the outside of buildings, I sort of build them in, but the way that the wireframing was designed was just a simple shape, and then you add in all of the external details and into like shapes on the outside of the building, which is really interesting, because when you look at the builds, they don't look like boring shapes. They look like they have their own shape, and it was interesting to try and recreate that, because usually I just manufacture in different shapes and don't pay too much attention to adding on separate shapes, smaller detail shapes on the outside. But that's sort of like the main thing in this style, which is very interesting. I also got to work on building in 45-degree angles and slightly off straight angles, which I haven't done a lot before. I want to work more on it, but yeah, it was really cool to work in different angles because I just sort of build like straight buildings on like non-diagonal axes.